Good day, everyone, joining us for this webinar from different parts of the world. Thank you all for joining us today for this official Nutrition for Growth side event on the topic of revolutionizing nutrition financing. I'm Alok Ranjan. I'm Director of Investments at the Power of Nutrition, and I'll be the session moderator for the day. I'm proud to co-host this session with Lawrence, Executive Director at GAIN, and Wilmore, who is Chief Executive Officer at Eleanor Crook Foundation, two leading organizations in the nutrition space and innovators in financing. First, I would like to welcome our large virtual audience representing a range of nutrition and financial stakeholders. I encourage you all to participate by introducing yourself in the chat and posting questions to our speakers in the QA section, question and answer section. Today, we are joined by an expert panel of presenters and speakers. The session will begin with a series of presentations covering the landscape and pathways of innovative financing in nutrition before a panel conversation with experts in this space. But first, I would want to reflect with our co-hosts on why we have chosen this topic for a Nutrition for Growth event the day before the official summit, when we expect to hear new and renewed pledges for fund to the nutrition. We all know that global funding is stretched now more than ever. COVID-19 has had a huge impact on global malnutrition levels. And this year's Global Nutrition Report showed that financing needs for direct nutrition interventions has also grown from $7 billion a year to $10.8 billion a year. At the Power of Nutrition, conversations with a diverse set of investors and implementing partners confirm that the resources are stretched to the max. The nutrition sector needs to protect important traditional sources of financing and continue to push for domestic resource allocation and oversee aid of nutrition. As a catalytic platform raising more money for nutrition through partnerships, collaboration is at the core of our model. Therefore, we believe the sector is best positioned to meet global goals by combining funding, aligning efforts behind proven interventions, and partnering with national government for maximum scale. But we also know that business as usual is not enough. The Power of Nutrition believes the nutrition sector needs to be pioneers in innovative financing to avoid replicating the nutrition's orphan status in traditional brand. This will allow us to mobilize new capital and help us plug the huge funding gap. Private sector, concessional, and catalytic finance is needed now more than ever. And we need to be bold in embracing the opportunities presented by innovative financing flows. That is why next year, the Power of Nutrition will launch its Nutrition Ventures, a new hub which will pilot and scale innovative finance mechanisms for nutrition. We are excited to share more about this soon. Today, over the next 90 minutes, we'll hear about successes seen in other sectors, such as green bonds, and consider how they can be replicated for nutrition. We'll also hear about innovative finance institutions, instruments, and collaborations that are happening already in nutrition and learn from their successes. Now, I'll hand it over to our co-organizers to provide more contextual comments to frame the discussion. Firstly, I'll hand over to Lawrence Haddad, who is Executive Director of GAIN, and then Wilmore from Chief Executive Officer at Eleanor Crook Foundation. They'll share their thoughts. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Alok, and it's a real pleasure for GAIN to be co-hosting this with Power of Nutrition and Eleanor Crook Foundation. The first version of my comments today had the line, official development assistance for nutrition as we know it is on life support. And that's probably a bit of a provocative statement, and it's kind of an overly pessimistic view of things. But we can't count on official development assistance for nutrition as we know it for much longer, it seems to me. N4G will breathe some life into it in 2021, a lot of life, and hopefully in 2024. But we need to really begin developing plans B and C. Now, I was at the European Commission in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and I was faced with the really frightening realization that only 3 of the 27 European Union member states are financing nutrition in a significant way. Germany, Netherlands, and Ireland. Of course, we're all hopeful about France. And in Norway, Switzerland, and the UK, we have other strong European players. But the number was small, at least in Europe. And as we've seen from the UK, the situation is not always as stable as we would like to think. In addition, the focus of ODA is more and more towards Africa. And of course, this is really important, but it leaves the malnourished in Asia high and dry, especially as they cope with COVID. So the irony is that the nutrition community really prides itself on its innovative programming, innovative policy, innovative metrics, but we have not moved with the times on finance. We're simply not innovative enough. We need to find ways to link to COVID and climate and resource envelopes, not because we want to leech off of them, but because we want to enrich them. We want to help those communities meet their goals as well as our goals. So we need to find ways to link to private institutional investors, high net worth individuals, crowdfunding mechanisms, blended finance, and impact investment funds. We simply can't nourish people if we cannot nourish financing for nutrition. And that's why GAIN is working so hard to advance this issue. And that's why we're so enthusiastic about this session. Back to you, Alok.
Thanks, Lawrence. And the provocative statement right at the outset was really needed for us all to reflect on the life support on which nutrition financing, you called out about that. I'll hand it over to Will. Will, over to you to share reflections from your side.
Thanks, Alok. And a big thanks to your team also, everybody at the Power of Nutrition. You guys worked really hard to bring all this together today. A lot goes into something like this, so really appreciate it. Lawrence, always nice to be doing something exciting like this with GAIN. As Alok said, my name's Will Moore, and I have the honor of serving as CEO of the Eleanor Crook Foundation. For those of you who don't know us, we are a US-based philanthropy, and we're exclusively focused on this fight against global malnutrition. If you're listening today, you probably already know that malnutrition is one of the greatest threats that we face. It's the #1 killer of kids. It's limiting the cognitive development and the workplace performance of about 1 in 3 people on Earth. And with COVID and conflict and climate change, it's getting worse. And there are really only 2 ways to scale up solutions to population level problems like malnutrition. Either you scale solutions through public systems using government resources, or you scale through private markets. And I'll be the first to say that we have so much unfinished business when it comes to scaling up those government grant-based solutions. When you look at most of the immediately effective solutions, things like prenatal vitamins for pregnant women, support for breastfeeding mothers, vitamin A supplementation for young kids, treatment with therapeutic foods for kids that are severely malnourished. For the foreseeable future, the only way that we're going to be able to start reaching the very poor populations that need these things most is going to be through government solutions and through grant-based resources. So I want to say at the outset, let's not forget that. But if we take a more macro view of malnutrition and a longer time horizon, we should also be asking, how does a country like Niger, a country with extremely high rates of severe malnutrition, become more like Denmark or Sweden over a 20-year time horizon, where, a country where severe malnutrition is a thing of the past, and these grant-based solutions to address malnutrition aren't even needed anymore? And I think the answer is almost certainly through market-based solutions. Things like strengthening nutritious food value chains, scaling up product innovations so that even a nation's poor can access and afford nutritious food for their families. And today we are living in a world where less than 1 in 5 kids is getting a minimum acceptable diet. And in many low and middle income countries, people are spending 75% of their income on food. And it's not good food. They're spending it on mostly empty calorie staple crops because those are the crops that the agricultural sector has prioritized, and that's what they can afford. So if we're going to end malnutrition for good, which is the goal, we do have to make nutritious food cheaper and more available. And the way that we do that is through innovative financing and market-based solutions. But as Lawrence said, for the nutrition sector, we're now talking a lot about private sector financing, which is a good first step, but we're really not yet doing it at any scale. And that's what I'm hoping that this conversation will help lead to. Back to you, Alok.
Thank you, Will. And what came out as a common thing between both Lawrence and you, Will, was the call out about how COVID and climate and conflict and these things are making this discussion all the more relevant at this point of time. So thanks to both Lawrence and Will. And I'll now go to Preet. Preet is, he's director at Palladium Impact Capital. Preet advises at Palladium the NGOs and private sector clients on impact investing, capital raising, strategy development, and more. And over the next 10 minutes in his presentation, Preet will share intelligence that Palladium undertook with, along with Power of Nutrition, mapping successful innovative financing mechanisms in a range of other sectors, including education and climate, and identifying high potential opportunities for replication in the nutrition sector. Preet, over to you.
Yep, thank you very much, Alok, and let me just reconfirm that everyone can hear me well. Okay, very good. So I'll echo the thanks once more to the Eleanor Crook Foundation and GAIN and Power of Nutrition for putting this together. We have spent 2021, as Alok was just saying, working with the Power of Nutrition on kind of understanding this conundrum. The fact that there is such a large financing gap with nutrition, and at the same time, we are not achieving, the nutrition sector is not quite achieving the success that some other people are seeing. Palladium Impact Capital specifically is an innovative finance advisory firm. We help design innovative finance investment vehicles, and we help to raise capital for them. And so, when we began working with the Power of Nutrition in 2021, one of the first things that we wanted to do is simply understand what the activity was of innovative finance in nutrition, where the gaps were, where we were seeing successes, and where we needed to catch up with other people. Other people, more meaning other sectors. We have seen climate, finance, financial inclusion, broader healthcare services, agribusiness, energy. We've seen them all mobilize billions of dollars to meet their financing gaps. But on our study, we saw that nutrition had been very much falling behind. In terms of numbers specifically, I think, Alok, you were mentioning kind of in the numbers in the range of $7 to $8 billion in terms of funding needs. We actually saw that the gap, the undersupply of funding, has ranged between 3 and 5 billion. So as of 2015, it was in the 3 billion range. Projecting out to 2025, it goes up to 5.5 billion. So the impetus for addressing this conundrum, thinking about this conundrum, putting our minds together to solve this conundrum of a lack of private sector market-based financing in nutrition is big. It is a $5.5 billion problem at the very minimum. And so what we wanted to do today, or at least what I'll attempt to do today, is provide you with a very brief glimpse of our work that will hopefully set the stage for the rest of the conversation. For us to begin thinking about where the potential is in terms of innovative finance, made us lean towards understanding what current activity is, and we wanted to take you through that mapping process, through that recognition of what has been done and what hasn't been done, and also we'll take the liberty of providing a couple of opinions on forward-looking direction. Again, all kind of with the hopes of not being prescriptive, but setting the stage for today's conversation. So with that, let me ask that we get started and move on to the very first slide. And thought we would show this to you all to give you a template for how we started thinking about innovative finance. innovative finance is a very, it can be, I'll use the word vague term, an amorphous term, one that, not everyone has a very, very strong lock on in the same exact way. So we wanted to first begin by segmenting what innovative finance means, essentially the tool categories that nutrition should think about employing. And what you have here is that segmentation on the numbers you see on the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this in no way is meant to own a segmentation, but it was one cut at what we thought was a useful way of thinking about where nutrition should start looking in terms of tools to mobilize private financing. And so, you'll see them here. Gift donation / aggregation mechanisms are, for example, what Power of Nutrition does in terms of trying to aggregate funding for nutrition. Pay for results mechanisms often refer to things like development impact bonds, whereby payments are only made when results are seen. I think everyone is very familiar with blended finance and impact investing, but that involves having private investors put money into investment funds that seek both a financial return as well as some sort of a social or environmental return as well. Market guarantees are newer instruments in our world, but they have started to be used with great success. They do involve de-risking private players to make them enter new markets and actually start firing off activity in new markets. There is the whole area of social bonds, which are different from development impact bonds. The social bonds here refers to going to capital markets and raising large amounts of money at scale from private investors through a bond instrument. We have seen that, in addition to green bonds, now social bonds have picked up a great deal of traction at scale, and there's a high demand for them. So we wanted to mark this as one category. And then finally, there are strategic partnerships, joint ventures, other types of collaborations to try and mobilize money into nutrition. So this was one dimension of what we had mapped. We also wanted to recognize that nutrition itself should be thought of in a couple of different ways. There are nutrition-specific ventures and interventions and nutrition-sensitive ones. And we wanted to also recognize that in terms of mobilizing innovative finance, there is, of course, the goal of moving as much money as possible into nutrition-specific interventions. But we understand that some innovative finance instruments are better for nutrition-sensitive types of interventions as well. And we've also, lastly, we've mapped on here non-nutrition interventions also, because we wanted to mark down ones that we should learn from for nutrition. And so that gives you just a glimpse of how we can landscape this world of innovative finance and nutrition. If we actually move to the next slide, we can start, we actually, our team in collaboration with the Power of Nutrition started mapping where the activity has been to date. And I won't try to go through this in any great depth, but I simply will say that we have had activity in nutrition. People have tried different things, and people have tried different things at different levels. So there, one cannot say at all that there has been no or unsuccessful or a complete dearth of activity in innovative finance. Attempts have been made. We have seen people like, as I'll kind of further point to in a minute on the next slide, we have seen people launch nutrition bonds. We have seen proper joint ventures happening in nutrition. We've seen pooled procurement mechanisms. We have seen a development impact bond or two. We have seen attempts made in trying to raise impact investment funds. And so nutrition has been making the attempts. And if we actually go to the next slide as well, we can see that quite a wide range of organizations have been making these attempts. So on nutrition bonds, for example, Danone, a large corporation, has made an attempt at launching a nutrition oriented development impact bond. We have seen people like DSM, along with several development finance institutions, start up Africa Improved Foods, which has been a relative success. We have seen people like Unit Life and UNCDF make interesting attempts at trying to raise private sector money, private sector gifts in nutrition. We have seen GAIN, they can talk a little bit more about their pool procurement facility later. They've made their own attempt at trying to make it more efficient to mobilize private capital. And so there has been no dearth of activity. I think where we tend to see the overall issue is when we start talking about kind of sizes and focus. So if we actually go on to the next slide, we'll see that essentially the numbers on the right. We took some of the initiatives that I just had provided examples on from our innovative finance landscape map, and we had tried to actually size what some of these are about. And so we see, at the highest levels, $75 to $80 million in funding being mobilized, and at the lowest levels, we're talking about $2 or $3 million. And when you think about this broadly, these are extremely small numbers. They're extremely small in comparison to what others in other sectors have been doing. I think, Alok, it was you who mentioned nutrition being an orphan across the world of innovative finance and impact investing. And what you see here pretty much quantifies, reasserts that orphan status. There's been only a handful of organizations that have been able to mobilize substantial amounts of money, and it's been done in relatively fragmented ways. Just as I was saying that many different organizations have made attempts at raising financing, one could also say it's been very fragmented. The attempts have been very scattered across many organizations with small amounts of money. And that perhaps tends to be the crux of the issue. If you actually go on to the next slide, one can see that what is happening in nutrition really is falling by the wayside in comparison to what others are doing. If you look at the bonds themselves, I mean, that tends to be a remarkable example. I think it was Danone's and one other corporation's nutrition sensitive bonds, not even nutrition specific, nutrition sensitive bonds that have raised about $373 million. But if you look at green bonds, there have been a couple of $100 billion raised. So that that is a large multiple from which nutrition is lacking. The same thing with DIBS, whereas we've only worked with one. We've seen in health and education a number of development impact bonds. Several have been launched. The same thing with pool funds. You can see the numbers here, and with other types of instruments, we've seen very little success. There have been no market guarantees till date. There's been, I think, GAIN can talk a little bit about maybe some progress they're making on the impact investing front, but till date, there has been no money deployed through impact investing vehicles, and so we have done, and I'll only touch upon this very briefly and try to conclude quickly now, but we have been doing a bit of thinking on what areas here tend to have will likely have the most potential in nutrition. I think at the medium level, blended finance and impact investing is one that one should pay strong attention to. We've seen, of course, people in financial inclusion, agribusiness, energy, other places raise quite a bit of money in this space. For us, I think in nutrition, agribusiness probably holds a great deal of potential, and blended finance will likely have to come into play. But we see some potential here within impact investing. We think there is some potential with market guarantees as well. But one of the big areas that we have been working with Power Nutrition on over the course of 2021 is these Sdg bonds. What we have been discovering is that kind of on the back of the wave of green bonds that have been successfully launched, we are seeing a greater and greater demand for social bonds. Now we see that the market has an extremely strong appetite for social bonds, and we have now, through what Alok mentioned as Nutrition Ventures, started to think about how we can actually launch social bonds very strongly in the context of nutrition. When these bonds are raised, they are raised at scale. They are raised very much from private sector investors, and if the demand is there, if the issuers of these bonds are there, if the investors are all in place, we think there is great potential there. And really, so this is something that we will be working with Power Nutrition on more and more in future. We do think there is a great deal of potential here to essentially play catch up, but hopefully overall this provides a picture of where we are, where the nutrition sector is in terms of actually working with innovative financing, and hopefully it gives you just a little bit of a glimpse of what what could be there in future for us. But with that, I will stop there, and Alok, I will hand it right back to you.
Thank you, Preet, for sharing some of these modalities that could be replicated in nutrition. I think this mapping is, as you said, called out. It's really helpful for the power of nutrition to hone our thinking for the nutrition ventures, and also identify pathways that could have the greatest impact for the global nutrition. What we'll do is we'll pick up some of these ideas in our panel discussions later in the session. And now I'll hand it over to Roberta Bowe, who is program lead for the Nutrition Food Financing Initiative, or N3F, a blended financing structure recently launched by GAIN. Roberta, over to you.
Thank you, Alok. And yeah, very, very happy to be here to talk about the Nutritious Food Financing Program, which we also refer to as N3F, our new approach to investment in nutrition. As most of our speakers just highlighted today, while nutrition initiatives in low and middle income countries have traditionally been supported with the public funding, donor or local governments, a major potential financial resource remains untapped, and that is private sector investment. N3F is one example initiated by GAIN with the goal to catalyze private sector investment in nutrition in Sub-Saharan Africa. If we go on the next slide, N3F is motivated by a key challenge that we see in food systems today, that is insufficient access to safe and nutritious food for low and middle income consumers in Sub-Saharan Africa. About 70% of Africans currently cannot afford a healthy diet. Only about half of fruit and vegetable volumes needed to meet WHO dietary recommendations is even available on the continent, let alone accessible. Small and medium enterprises, what we refer to as SMEs, are central to the food supply. They deliver about 3/4 of the food that is consumed in Sub-Saharan Africa, and they're active throughout the food value chain, acting as input providers, off-takers, processors, and distributors. And they're also essential for smallholder farmers. SMEs require financing to be able to grow and scale, but in Africa, they often struggle to access finance. And while blended finance and impact investing volumes are growing globally, only a small percentage is allocated to food and agriculture, with climate action and sustainability as top themes. The past decade has seen an increased number of investment vehicles that supply capital to agriculture and food businesses, as well as funds that address supply chain efficiency, opportunity, and infrastructure. However, many of these agriculture and food funds often focus on export crops, often with a limited nutritional value, such as coffee, that are not meant for consumption by people in low-income countries where they are produced. And this results in most investment funds in Africa being focused on increasing the quantity of food for export markets and not the quality of food that is produced for the local markets. And N4G is a first of its kind nutrition first facility that is aimed at filling this gap. If we go on the next slide, please, we can look at the theory of change that we built for N4G. So N4G proposes to increase access to nutritious and safe food by supporting SMEs throughout the value chain with targeted funding as well as technical assistance. The idea is that by providing those firms with the funding together with technical assistance, the SMEs will be able to make investments in increasing their production, improving their level of efficiencies, identifying new sales channels, as well as investing in R&D. And we expect that those actions will result in increased access to nutritious food, as well as increased supply of nutrients and reduced harmful elements, such as sugars, through product reformulation, and increased food safety and reduced environmental impact through improvement when it comes to decreased food losses. If we go to the next slide, we can look at the structure of N4G. So N4G has been designed as a collaboration between the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, and Incofin Investment Management. So while GAIN is a nutrition organization, we needed a partner in the investment space, and Incofin was a great match. They're a licensed investment fund manager with over 20 years experience in private debt and equity investment in emerging markets, with over 1 billion euro in assets under management. The idea was to leverage respective expertise of Incofin and GAIN, having Incofin and GAIN play significant roles in the three components of N4G. So if we look at the first component is a direct investment fund that is going to be managed by Incofin to make senior and junior debt investments to SMEs. It'll be an open-ended debt fund, starting at about 10 million and growing up to 60 million. And we will use a blended funding structure with different capital tranches and risk profiles. The second component is the technical assistance, and we expect this to be funded to about 15% of the funds. It will be led by GAIN, and it will operate separately from the fund and provide targeted support to the SMEs that the fund will invest in. And the third and final component will focus on the monitoring and learning part. And this component basically oversees the monitoring, evaluation, and learning aspects. Will convene stakeholders and sharing knowledge on all the relevant topics that are related to investment in nutrition. This component as well will be grant funded separately from the fund and will be led by GAIN. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can look at the approach that we've been talking about, a blended finance approach. So N4G proposed an innovative approach in the sense that, as you can see from the graph, there are different capital tranches that have been designed to accommodate 4 different risk profiles of investors. You'll see the catalytic shares that will act as a first loss compartment, the long-term locked up shares, about 7 years for more patient investors. And then you have the redeemable shares that are for investors, mainly private, that are seeking more liquidity. And the idea is that with such a structure, we believe that we can attract a variety of investors interested to contribute to nutrition improvement in Sub-Saharan Africa. We're currently in conversation with several partners for the different tranches. You can see a few names on the slides, and we are aiming at a first close 10 million in 2022 to scale up the fund up to 60 million in the coming 3 years. If we get to the next slide, we can see what are the SMEs that we're targeting with N4G. So N4G's focus is on Sub-Saharan Africa, currently looking at 13 countries in East and West Africa, including, for example, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, Benin. And you can see on the map where we screen most candidates today for potential investments. We're leveraging 3 channels to be able to identify a pipeline of potential investees. We're leveraging Gains, own network, Inca fans, as well as other partners. And we're looking at investing across the value chain. So we're looking at operators from inputs all the way to retail, with the focus on processing, distribution, and marketing on nutritious foods. The companies will have to be involved in supporting production of safe and nutritious foods for the domestic population in Sub-Saharan Africa. And priority will be given to nutrition-dense, minimally processed foods. And N4G will also have a bespoke gender lens in the sense that it will give priority to women-led companies, those who employ women in high-quality jobs and offer products and services that disproportionately benefit women and girls. If we go to the next slide, we can start looking at the other 2 components that I mentioned before. So I mentioned that alongside the fund, there are 2 other components, and one of them is the technical assistance. And while finance is a key barrier to growth for SMEs, it is definitely not the only one. As many SMEs, owner and employees often lack formal training when it comes to business best practices, as well as food safety and nutrition. And those have potential to inhibit their growth. So N4G was designed with a technical assistance facility that will be provided to all N4G investees. And it will include different types of TAs. As you can see on the left, we have type of TA that is focused on business management and performance, such as business planning, strategy development. And on the other hand, we'll also provide a nutritious and food safety specific assistance, supporting SMEs in product formulation and labeling. The idea is that by providing this technical assistance to SMEs, they will be able to improve their efficiency, become more financially sustainable, become more effective and efficient, as well as in their goal to increasing access to nutritious food for the local markets. And then the last component, if we move to the next slide, it's the monitoring and evaluation component. We know that the market currently is lacking agreed upon metrics when it comes to what defines nutrition as an investment theme. And N4G wants to address these by developing and validating as well metrics for targeting nutrition-sensitive investments. Being an impact-first fund, N4G will consider the impact of the SMEs at every stage of the investment process. So starting at the initial screening, for firms to be included or not in the pipeline, we'll be using an internally developed tool to assess the eligibility criteria, depending on the type of food. So excluding the bad, like, for example, highly sweetened sugar beverages, such as soda, will be excluded, and we'll make sure to include the goods, right? Fruit, vegetables, eggs. And moving from the initial screening into the second step, the second stage is the what we call the impact audit. And at the impact audit, we will basically be using a holistic approach, assessing the SME impacts across 5 impact dimensions. So we're looking at gender, environment, employment, suppliers, and nutrition. And among this, nutrition will be given the most weight. And then once the investment has been made, there will be ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And we will examine about 25 indicators that we're looking at aligning with the IRIS standards that are used in impact investments, as well as the SDG. And I'd like to say that for us, the monitoring component is very key, because N4G is a proof of concept, but our ambition is far beyond the initial 60 million fund, as we aim with this to prove that nutrition is investable, unlock more funding and make nutrition the next lens for impact investing. So yeah, with that, I'm leaving it back to you, Alok.
Thank you, Roberta. It's great to see and hear the whole concept of the N3F and how it will support the SMEs with financing and the technical assistance to increase the access to nutritious food. What I really liked here is to see the whole collaboration component, bringing in experts from that side in Incofen, the TA component, and the strong monitoring, evaluation, and the metrics component linked with it throughout the investment process. So that was really good to see it connected through and through. Would love to take a question and bring the question to you, Roberta. We have an audience question, which is about what makes N3F different from other agribusiness funds investing in SMEs in Sub-Saharan Africa. I would like to take that.
Sure, thank you, Alok. And I mean, I'd say that firstly, that there could be probably three aspects that make N3F different. And the first one is that N3F is the first nutritious fund focused on locally produced nutritious food to be consumed by local population. So not focused on export markets. And it is a partnership, as you just highlighted, it is a partnership between, on one side, you have an expert nutrition organization, and then you have an expert farm manager with solid investment track record. And we believe that that combination gives all the key ingredients to make it a success. The second differentiating factor is the unique impact framework that has been developed by nutrition experts together with the Incofin team, so that it will link back when it comes to linking it back to impact investment standard for IRIS metrics and SDGs, and hopefully build a standard. Because finally, then that is probably the last point. It's like the idea is that it has an innovative approach that will hopefully has the potential to provide a demonstration effect and make tools available to other investors to be able to attract further capital for nutrition, and have other investment funds that are even looking at agriculture starting to add this lens to their approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta, and thanks for taking that question, and thanks for sharing again the approach of the N3F. Lots to learn from that for the various stakeholders. Now I would like to invite Andy Huskowitz, who is Chief Development Officer at the US International Development Finance Corporation, and Jim Bernhardt, who is Deputy Coordinator for the Development for Feed the Future at USAID. Andy leads the DFC's effort to pursue highly developmental projects in less developed countries and manages relationship with the private sector. Jim holds the dual role of assistant to the administrator in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and the deputy coordinator for development for Feed the Future, the US government's global hunger and food security initiative. Together, they will speak about the Global Nutrition Financing Alliance, a partnership to improve nutrition in low and middle income countries. Over to you, Andy and Jim.
Great, thank you so much. I find this extremely exciting for a few reasons. So just a little bit of background on me. I worked for USAID for 20 years before coming over to DFC, which is the US government's development finance institution, about 2 years ago as the Chief Development Officer. But one of the very first things I worked on when I joined USAID back in 2001 is that I was part of a small legal team that was working on helping the establishment of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, Gavi, and the Global Fund for TB and HIV/AIDS. And the idea back at the time was that we realized 20 years ago that USAID and other development institutions didn't have enough money to do and solve these problems ourselves. And we had to create these organizations and foundations that were going to try to gather funding from a wide array of stakeholders to try to tackle these issues. And then if you fast forward now 20 years, we look at what Gain's doing. We look at what Gavi's doing. Until recently, Gavi wasn't a household name. Everybody knew what the Global Fund was, but it was this work that we created back, I guess it was in the Bush administration when they had the Global Development Alliances. And when I looked at some of the slides that were shown, even though folks feel that the situation is dire, when you look at the number of parties and entities and stakeholders that are involved, really what we're seeing is an evolution. And the next evolution is these financing facilities, because we realize, okay, the ODA coming from an individual donor agency is not enough. So let's reach out to foundations. This was sort of phase one going back 20 years, but we're starting to realize and more that we can really solve and address these issues in a much more impactful way by mobilizing financing. And that's what DFC does. DFC works hand in hand with USAID. I always describe us as USAID's bank. But what we can do is we can take a relatively modest amount of ODA and turn it into a significantly larger amount of financing. What I mean by that is for DFC to issue a $50 million loan, it usually requires about, let's say, $5 million of our appropriation in order to get the US Treasury to issue that loan. So when the COVID pandemic hit, one of the things that I actually wasn't thrilled with was when there was money coming in, supplemental money coming in to quickly get money out the door. I was looking at money being spent on cash transfers to get money in the hands of people in Pakistan and other places. And my reaction to that was, if we were to have that $10 million that's being used for cash transfers and instead you bring it to DFC, we could turn it into $100 million of lending. And lending in sectors where they need it most. Now, not every loan is going to get paid back, but you can reach many, many more people. And not only are you reaching more people, but you're helping people establish a credit history. You're helping people potentially get title to their land once they establish that credit history, which from a sustainable development standpoint is way more impactful. And this is why financing is key. And one of the greatest things that Jim Bernhardt and his team have done is they funded a food security unit over at DFC. And that food security unit at DFC, what it's allowed us to do is take the US government's commitment to nutrition and food security, and we've been able to increase that to $1 billion in financing. We've already done $250+ million in financing for food security. And that's with just a modest amount of money that was transferred, a few $1 million from USAID to DFC, because with that food security unit, those people, they're focusing on finding the right types of transactions. What I love about N3F, though, is if you think through where we were with gender 30 years ago, in terms of thinking through how you mainstream gender as you're doing an analysis of every transaction compared to where we are today. And even now, we're seeing that a lot of the DFIs, including DFC, is now looking at every transaction under a climate lens. What N3F does is it's really the first mover to show how we can have this impact framework. And whether or not the DFIs, whether it's through the N3F mechanism or not, anytime we do a food security transaction or an ag transaction, looking at how we can adopt that impact framework and do a nutrition analysis and see, all right, how can we take this transaction that might be involved in only exporting coffee or cashews or something from Sub-Saharan Africa, which is still important from an economic growth standpoint, but can we put a nutrition analysis on top of this transaction and see if there are things that we can do to better impact the recipients of that financing? So I really see this as a first move in the next phase as to where we're going to go. And I hope that this group will work collectively together to do this. We're excited about our partnership with USAID, the Eleanor Crook Foundation. We've committed $100 million to this effort, but we're looking forward to continuing to learn and working with all of you. And I'm quite hopeful that what we're going to be able to do, working hand in hand with USAID, Eleanor Crook, and the others on this call with Gain and others, is really move the needle. And so that 20 years from now, again, the picture is going to look very different than when it looked 20 years ago when I first started working at USAID. Thank you. I turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Andy. That was an excellent setup for me. I appreciate it. And I love the way you framed this introduction to the Global Nutrition Financing Alliance. You know, it is an ideal partnership between USAID, DFC, and the Eleanor Crook Foundation. And what I love about it is that it plays to the respective strengths of our institutions, which is fantastic. And I think with this, we have an audience here of some of the best minds in nutrition. So I will not spend any time talking about the current state of nutrition, and the fact of the matter is that the last 2 years of this pandemic have seen figures going in the wrong direction in terms of the numbers of people who we anticipate will require additional resources to try to rise above the line and getting access to nutritious food and as a result of the pandemic. So, and I know the most recent Global Nutrition Report, presents this backsliding in detail with this really massive $10 billion a year requirement for investment, which is why the Global Nutrition Financing Alliance comes at an opportune time. USAID, the DFC, and the Eleanor Crook Foundation are each going to then bring a different skill set to the alliance. And as Andy just mentioned, we're mobilizing 100 million in financing over the next 5 years to tackle malnutrition in low and middle income countries by harnessing private sector solutions across health and food systems. There's clearly a need for greater financing to increase the availability and affordability of safe and nutritious foods. And the DFC is well positioned to help fill that role. But we also must ensure that the investments are generating the intended impact on nutrition and improved diets, which is where USAID's leadership is essential. Our technical expertise across nutrition and agriculture sectors, coupled with our reach and capacity to achieve development outcomes in local contexts, those pieces will help ensure that we're focusing financing investments truly targeted for nutrition impact. As part of the alliance, USAID is establishing a set of screening criteria to standardize our approach to nutrition investing. We also plan to develop better metrics to guarantee that our work is achieving the intended impact. Now, and a great example of how we plan to close that financing gap through the alliance is the N3F, the Nutrition Foods Financing Facility. Roberta's already discussed that N3F is targeting small and medium enterprises in Sub-Saharan Africa with the explicit aim of increasing the affordability, availability, and desirability of safe, nutritious foods for local populations. So we're supporting the N3F in a couple of ways. First, we're assisting in the design of the fund structure and conducting research to ensure the fund responds to market dynamics. And that's critical for the sustainability. If we really are going to make this work and scale it, it has to be market driven, right? And second, we're supporting the evaluation of the fund's impact on dietary outcomes and have planned contribution of $1 million to the N3F fund as a first loss capital to de-risk other investments and crowd in investments from those that might be standing on the sideline thinking about getting in. So we know that much more is needed to close the gap on financing for nutrition. And USAID, in collaboration with the DFC and others, is taking significant steps to address these shortcomings. And we're hopeful that others, particularly many on this call today, will join us in this endeavor. So with that, I'd like to thank the Power of Nutrition, the Eleanor Crook Foundation, and GAIN for hosting this important event as we are about to launch into the Nutrition for Growth Summit. And I'll hand it back over to you. Alok, am I passing it back to you, right?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks, Jim. It's really inspiring to hear how agencies are coming together for the Alliance and the bold commitments everyone is working towards. We have time for one more question, and the question I'll pose to first Andy and then Jim is, how does success for the Alliance look like for both of you? What does a success for the Alliance look like?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this. I think it's interesting. It's always challenging when you think through food security transactions, because really what we do as DFC is we have to find transactions that are commercially viable. But what a lot of people don't realize is when we became Development Finance Corporation, previously we were the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and USAID's Development Credit Authority, our legislative tools and mandate changed, because it used to be that OPIC, our predecessor agency, had to survive off of the proceeds of its loans. Congress has set us up in a way where they really want us to have a big development impact, and we have to identify what is appropriate financial performance. We haven't yet defined what appropriate financial performance is. Appropriate financial performance could mean a heavy emphasis on blended financing, which means we actually might lose a little bit of money, which is okay as far as I'm concerned. Others in DFC don't agree, which is why it's still an ongoing discussion right now. But for me, what success, so I go back to one of the transactions that we did that USAID supported was a transaction with Root Capital to try to do to get financing and do guarantees for smallholder farmers all throughout the world. But there was a lot of debate about this because from USAID's perspective, the focus was heavily on export crops. And what I like about this new alliance is the increased emphasis on that impact framework. And if we can learn from that and see how we can still ensure that transactions are commercially viable, but also incorporate certain modest steps to improve nutritional outcomes, that will be success in my mind. And something that can then be translated to other transactions moving forward outside of the financing facility.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump right in, huh? Is that what you?
Yeah. Jim, over to you. It's the same question.
Well, yeah, let me just table thump Andy's point. Investing in agribusiness isn't new. We've been doing this for decades, both USAID, the DFC and its predecessor OPIC, and such. So we have experience in that, but having investors in businesses with the express aim at improving local diets and addressing malnutrition is very new. So I do think that we need to recognize the importance of standardizing our approach, this nutrition investing, we're calling it, so that we will see that success then would be seeing that kind of rolling out as a standard for other investors across the board, right? So that investing with a nutrition lens, with nutrition outcomes, becomes a standard and commonplace. As right now we have a gender lens, right, that has become incorporated globally and is a well-respected standard. And then the second piece for me would be the scaling and sustainability of this. This will not work unless there is the market proves that it works. And so we use our public funds to create an investment, de-risk, and then we see that scaling up to that very daunting figure of 10 billion a year. But most of that's going to have to come through the private sector investment, and proving that this can be a profitable enterprise, I think will be key for all of us. Back to you.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Andy. It's great to see all the thoughts that are coming in, and I think with the next session that we have, which is around the panel discussion, it will be very useful to reflect on all that we have heard across different presenters. So thanks to Andy, Jim, Roberta, and Preet, all of you, for the presentations and the great discussions we had in the panel discussion. We are now going to have a conversation with our co-hosts, Will and Lawrence, along with our expert guests, Trina and Bettina, to comment on the discussion so far. I'll first introduce Trina Cousin. She is the founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future, an organization that invests in and provides services to innovative, market-driven food and agriculture enterprises. Trina is also a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She was there at the very start of the Power of Nutrition and played a key role in establishing our catalytic model. She also continues to be our special advisor. And I'll also now introduce Bettina. So Bettina Prato is a senior coordinator for the Smallholder and Agri SME Finance and Investment Network, SAFIN, S-A-F-I-N, a network housed within the International Fund for Agriculture Development, IFAD. So SAFIN brings together around 50 institutions operating in agri-food and rural SME investment, with a focus on access to finance and complementary services. I'd like to ask a series of questions to our panelists, but I'll also encourage comments from our other expert speakers too, as well as questions from the audience via the Q&A section. So in this section, my first question would be to Ertrin. Welcome, Ertrin. And the question that I'm posing to you is, like, with traditional aid on the decline, what strategies look promising for mobilizing new capital at scale towards projects that improve nutrition? And what areas of investment should the capital flow be best targeted?
Well, thank you very much for that question. But first, let me thank the organizers of this very important and enlightening discussion this morning, Gain the Power of Nutrition and the Eleanor Crook Foundation. I'm honored that I've had the privilege of working with each one of these organizations over the years and know how critical each one of them is to the success of scaling up nutrition across the global community. You know, when Lawrence opened up this conference with his remarks talking about that nutrition is an orphan, and he said that was provocative. My first thought that came to mind was, it may not be an orphan, but it's definitely an underfunded stepchild of the development community. And the challenge is that in a post-COVID, and we're not even post-COVID yet, but in a COVID-affected world, and with the focus now so much on climate, and the narratives that support additional funding into the developing world focused on infrastructure related climate investments, the opportunity to build a narrative that supports investment in nutrition is ours to win. But here's the challenge. The most of the investments for SMEs and smallholder farmers that make up the bulk of the food system in developing emerging markets are modest needs that and the operators have limited access to collateral, and there's uncertain growth prospects. And so when we talk about the tools that are required, when the Food Systems for the Future began this work, we identified the messy middle, that space between the seed stage and the growth stage to provide capital to grow. But when we began looking at opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa, we recognized that creating blended capital tools that included grant capital to support what is required for the testing stage, the development stage, to get those companies to that growth stage is critical to bringing together not just the de-risking with grant capital, but to identify the opportunity for scale that private sector capital is going to require to even come into the deals. And so the much like N3F is a proof of concept fund, the work that we're doing with Food System for the Future is also a proof of concept fund, but to suggest that we can work with grant capital to create the ecosystem support, both from an internal standpoint with the companies themselves, as well as an external standpoint with the policies and partnerships that are necessary to support the success of attracting blended capital, both the public and charitable capital, as well as the private sector capital, will work. We don't know, we've heard a lot here today about what is possible in this space, but what is obvious in this space is that right now we haven't gotten very much beyond talk. And so we need these new proof of concepts on all of the different tools that we're talking about. And I'm not going to repeat what others have said today, but what we need to recognize is the opportunity we have as a community of interest to work together to make deals that are much more attractive to commercial investors, that will provide the opportunity for us to create that development stage and then to scale up. Because if we want to come back 20 years from now and see a different landscape, it's going to mean that these new tools that we've talked about all day today have created the proof of concepts and moved beyond that to support to the actual investment of increased capital to change what is the reality of today for nutrition as a stepchild.
Thank you, Ashwin. And the calling it out as underfunded stepchild is something that is so critical to keep in mind as we all are looking at how do we move and fast track this whole discourse and the results and cross learning and everything, so that 15 years, 20 years down the line, we don't end up being at a stage, at a trajectory where we would not want to be with a slow start at this point of time, and how can we fast track that whole process. So thanks a ton for that whole push on this component. And I'll go to Bettina for my next question. And Bettina, the question is, how do we incentivize more private finance nutrition investment for the least developed countries? And how can we work with local finance institutions to achieve this?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this question. And I would echo earlier in the previous speaker in just thanking also the organizers and congratulating you for this event. So I think this is really the billion-dollar question, or maybe I should say the trillion-dollar question in some sense, because you can't really get more investments flowing towards nutrition without really supporting local financial ecosystems, so that this is mainstreamed into the local financial sectors. And I think my perspective here is very much that of SAFIN, which is not a network that operates in the nutrition specific space, but very much in the nutrition sensitive space around food and agricultural value chains. Specifically, you could answer the question in a different way if you looked at other parts of even of the nutrition sensitive landscape. And here, I think much of what I would say echoes what Roberta said before, which is that really incentivizing private investments in this space is very much about supporting local food markets. And that means not just production, but also all of those pre and post-production activities that really impact massively on the nutritional quality, diversity, also affordability, and frankly, the appeal of food for local consumers, and also for those who prepare food. And we know that in most cases, this is going to be women, so their convenience factor. And taking into account the dietary transitions that we know are underway also across many of the LDCs. And the SME focus that N3F has in this regard, I think is absolutely spot on. We know that it's mostly small and medium enterprises that play key roles across food value chains in these economies, although of course their structure varies. And now, the question of how you work with local financial institutions, in part, it's also context specific, because you want to look at who are the key actors that have a capacity or an interest in engaging with SMEs in different markets. But very often, I think we tend to over focus as sort of international observers or development partners. We over focus on the international actors, the sort of international sources of capital. It's also really important to focus on the local, impact-oriented social lending landscape, which is present in a number of LDCs, although not necessarily operating in food and agriculture everywhere, as well as the local banking sector, which in many cases suffers from asset challenges, fiduciary duties that really discourage taking the level of risks that is often associated with food or agri SMEs, but still represents a first line of entry into the financial space for small and medium enterprises. So what kind of challenges do these types of institutions face? Very often they face high transaction costs when it comes with client acquisition, client management in this particular sector, and even more if we're asking them to understand what it means to factor nutrition into their financial decisions. So there's data issues, there's data management, and data gathering issues that are important to address, maybe through technology, but also through other means, standardization of metrics, etc. The second is the risk profile of many of these enterprises. So we need to invest on the risk-taking, the risk tolerance capabilities of these financial institutions. And three is a pipeline. There's not so many investable business models in the at the SME space or at the SME level that have capacity to deliver demonstrably impact on nutrition. So I think there are three parts to the answer to the question. First is to really try to reduce the transaction costs that these institutions face. And that very much means also investing in data and metrics. Second, the risk, maybe blending has a space there, but it's not the only way. And three is working maybe with the enterprise support ecosystem to really accelerate the development of more business models that are nutrition positive and that are operating at this SME scale. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. And those three aspects that you highlighted really is quite insightful. And what I would do is pose the same question to Will as well. So Will, the question is to you is similar, like how do we incentivize more private finance nutrition investment for the least developed countries? And how can we work with the local finance institutions to achieve this? Your reflection on the same questions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with everything that Bettina said. Anyone will invest in a business-based solution to malnutrition if you insure them against loss and you offer them a guaranteed 8% return. I mean, you could sign me up, you could take my whole retirement fund if those are the terms. And I think those are essentially the terms that a lot of local financial institutions are insisting on. And those are the terms that a lot of big international development banks are saying that they require. And those are really difficult terms to meet when you're looking at, business-based solutions in countries that have really high burdens of malnutrition and to reach populations that are really suffering from malnutrition. So for the big development finance institutions that are using public funds, I think we need to push them to accept more risk and to accept less return. Unfortunately, there's not always a way to solve big problems and make everyone rich in the process. But regardless, to unlock some of these big development finance resources in these countries that need them most, the biggest missing piece that we're consistently seeing is for that catalytic concessional capital that's required to attract those traditional investors. That money to identify and develop deals, money for first loss, money for technical assistance. That's what's missing. And to bring in the financiers, we need players who are not worried about financial returns. We need donors to put up the catalytic capital. So we need bilateral donors like USAID, and we need philanthropies like our foundation, like other foundations, which is what the Global Nutrition Financing Alliance is working to do, working to bring those donors and those investors together in this world. In the short term, I think we need some help from the advocacy community. We need some smart advocacy to convince donors to come to the table, to start investing grant capital in these private sector solutions. And I think it's a pretty easy sell. I mean, I think it's a really exciting opportunity for a certain type of grant maker. One of the hardest things about being a traditional donor is knowing that even if you identify a really effective grant-based solution, if it's scaled through a public system, you're always going to need grant or government resources to keep it going. So, once you start a grant-based program, it's just really hard to get out. If you pull your grant funds, even, 10 years down the line, more often than not, things fall apart. And with this development finance, the calculus is really different. 100 million in more grant-based resources and concessional capital, it can unlock billions of investment capital for these next generation private enterprises that really could help bring better nutrition to these high burden countries. And talk about sustainability. Not all of these businesses will succeed, but once you establish a new market for a nutritious crop, or for post-harvest storage technology, once you build that business, you're scaling it through the market and it becomes fully self-sustaining. So you might need a few million in grant-based resources to get it going, but once it takes off, it's self-sustaining. And as a donor, you can move on to the next thing and let the market do its work. So as a donor, I think that's really exciting.
Great to hear that from you, Will. And as a donor, calling out that biggest missing piece and the need to address that biggest missing piece is quite a critical component. We have one more round of questions to all four of you, and I'll looking at the time that we have, just a request to be a bit concise in the answers. I'll go first with my question to Lawrence. Lawrence, Roberta has told us what N3F is and how it will work and what it is trying to achieve. But you were there when the very idea of N3F was hatched. And what is the inside story on why GAIN decided to develop N3F?
Thanks, Alok. I mean, when the team, I've been at GAIN for 5 years now, and the team came to me 4 years ago, and they said, we want to do this. We think this is really important. So I said, first of all, why on earth we're going to work with SMEs? And they educated me on SMEs, even though, you know, SMEs, it's just what Will said. SMEs they've got scaling in their DNA. Yes, they're private sector, so they have scaling in their DNA, but they're also small and medium sized, and they want to grow. So they've got scaling doubly in their DNA, really, really important. So and collectively, they're already scaled. They're producing and supplying 70% of the food. So that was the first question, why SMEs? Second question was why finance to SMEs? Why is that the constraint? Then you look at the World Bank surveys, you look at GAIN's own surveys, it's pretty clear that finance is a key constraint. It's not always the only key constraint, but it's a key constraint. And then finally, you know, why GAIN? I mean, surely others are doing this. No, they're not. It's too risky. What can we do at GAIN to de-risk this? Well, we've got the experience. We've got 15 years of experience working with SMEs in Africa, giving them grants. We've seen how unsustainable that is. We've got a strong pipeline of investable propositions from those SMEs because we've been working with them, however, in the grant making sector. And then we can develop the nutrition metrics. It's taken us 2 years to do it, but there's 25 indicators looking at 4 key outcomes. Now, the one area we had less experience in was fund management. And so we partnered with one of the best in the business, Incafin. So it was kind of a diagnosis from a nutrition perspective, but execution from a business perspective. And that's a very intentional marriage. And Alok, knowing I won't have time to get to the second question. The second question is, what's the biggest challenge you're facing? And it's really what Will said. Yeah, the pipeline and the metrics were fairly straightforward, actually. It's about getting that first loss catalytic financing. And you know, Judith Rodin, when she was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, said philanthropy must peel back the first layer of risk, right? Making development and commercial investment dollars more productive and less risky. And Rockefeller and ECF have been really catalytic, but the public sector has to come forward to join the others to provide catalytic funding. And this is where the mindset shift has to happen. I completely agree with Will about advocacy. Let's be clear, the gravity can direct catalytic funding in 2 ways. The first way is it can be money down the drain if it's used to catalyze a badly designed program. But if it's used to catalyze a well-designed program, it can create an investment and credit snowball effect, such as Andy and Will and others have said. So even if the loan is not repaid in full or the investment does not generate the positive return we were looking for, in a well-designed fund, the loan or the investment will generate a positive public return. And this is surely what public sector finance, this is what you're in the business for. Back to you, Alok.
Thank you, Lawrence. And thanks for sharing the kind of history, journey, and the challenges that you're facing with the N3F and all the best and success, as this seems to be a very strong and solid model. My next question is to you, Ertharin, and the question is, how can we leverage the public-private partnership to enhance the risk-return profiles of investment in the least developed countries? How can sovereign credit risk profiles be enhanced to assess the affordable rates in capital markets? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And I think that question's been answered by many of the speakers here today, talking about the need for catalytic capital and capital to de-risk the capital stack in order to support the inclusion of non-traditional private sector commercial capital into those capital stacks, whether you're talking about an emerging market company or an LDC. But I think that Bettina was quite clear when answering the question about LDCs and the need for local capital. The idea that we are going to see sovereign wealth funds supporting the capital stacks in LDCs without both that catalytic and de-risking capital as well as local capital is not realistic. And the larger challenge that we have with the sovereign wealth funds is that historically they have been involved in very large, very long-term investments like infrastructure. And as we've been talking about here today, the majority of nutrition sensitive investment is in SMEs and small holders and not necessarily in these large infrastructure. The possibility of creating new vehicles for consolidating SPVs that would support particular investments in enterprises that could be consolidated into a package to create a vehicle to attract sovereign wealth capital is something that is now being explored at the academic level, but is not happening on the ground. And so these are issues that we should continue to talk about. But with the other opportunity that we have, as Lawrence talked about, the GAIN fund, is how can we co-invest with actors on the ground to support and attract additional additional capital that is today not in play in this space.
Thank you, Astrid. And the reflection on taking it from the academic level to ground is really a good spotlight for us to focus on. My next question is to you, Bettina. And the question is, like other sectors have seen an exponential rise in financing for companies and projects that support green and social developmental objectives. Can nutrition take advantage of this ESG financing wave or tsunami or avalanche, as many people say? And what can we learn from this?
Thank you. This is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, so I'm really glad to address it. I think nutrition has to take advantage of this wave, otherwise it's going to be, it's going to drown under it. For me, there is actually a risk that the differentiated appetite for different parts of the ESG acronym for most investors is going to really lead to maybe a really substantial growth of very green net, sort of zero carbon investment pipelines coming on the market, coming to the attention of investors in the coming years, and nutrition impact really being sidelined a bit. So if you keep your focus on the SME level, which I think is really important for local food markets in many, if not all, emerging economies, I think there the challenge is really with aggregation, aggregating investable transactions up to the scale that is going to be appealing for a large ESG investor. This is a main lesson that I think I take from other sectors, is that they've been able to address the challenge of financial aggregation or real economy transaction aggregation in an effective way. So I think what N3F is doing in terms of proof of concept about what is investable, what is scalable is really important, but we also need a lot of innovation in, strictly speaking, the financial aggregation space, sort of building up what is a nutrition sensitive portfolio in ag, in sort of, other parts of the value chains, in energy, in other sectors. We really need to accelerate that part of the work to meet the size and scale requirements of large ESG investors.
Thank you, Bettina. My last question is to Will. Can we attract large-scale affordable finance for investments in nutrition projects without grant aid? And if we need grant aid, how can we wean investments of initial grant aid to sustain and monetize them in the long term?
Yeah, I'll keep this one short because I think there's pretty good consensus on the panel, and we've sort of answered this one in a number of different ways. Can we attract the investment capital we need without a lot more grant-based capital? I think the answer is clearly no. Otherwise, I think it would have happened already. And as Andy said, giving the DFC as an example, with their current approach to unlock around 50 million in investment capital, they need about 5 million in more grant-based catalytic capital. I don't think that that's going, that equation is going to change dramatically in the near future, although we'll keep pushing these these development finance institutions to take a little bit more risk and accept a little less return. But I think there's another really important missing piece here, which is the lack of investable deals, even with that catalytic capital. And Bettina's been touching on this. It's not like there are thousands of businesses out there with perfect business plans, with solid foundations, with proven approaches to improving nutrition that are ready to go tomorrow if we just get them that financing that they need. There's work to be done to get businesses to that point that they really are viable from an investment standpoint. So this is another role that donors need to start playing. We need to use grant resources to develop new business-based solutions and to help small enterprises build the capacity they need to become investment ready. And as Bettina said, to help aggregate those investors. So once again, my final plug is calling on all donors. Please start investing some of your resources in private sector solutions for nutrition.
Thank you, Will, for that call out. And it's been a massively encouraging and exciting and learning experience to hear from all of you on these components. Now we are at the end of the webinar, and we would like to use next remaining few minutes to get reflection from all the co-hosts. Before going to Will and Lawrence, I'll share what were the three key things for me in this whole thing in the last 1.5 hour discussion. And my number one thing is that there are a lot of good starts we are seeing, and there is a lot to learn from other sectors who have been trying these out, and the new proof of concept, the N3F that we heard from the gain side. So there are many things that's happening for us to utilize and learn and cross-learn around. Second key component for me that came across was the whole need for standardization, the whole focus on the metrics, monitoring and learning, the impact framework, and as it was called out, that there needs to be an appropriate financial performance mapping of these matrices. And the third component, which I felt was really useful, was to look at the whole the scale and sustainability aspect of it, where the calling out to mainstream this into local financing system was something which is quite key and critical for us to really take all these solutions to scale and to sustain as we wanted to see after 15, 20 years, seeing an impact of these. Would hand it over to Will for your reflection, and then Lawrence for your reflection.
Thanks, Alok. In just a minute, I think my main takeaway is that there is good developing consensus on what's needed. I think we're hearing a lot of similar things from everybody that participated today, which is a positive development, a fairly new development, I think. So to me, I think the next step is to start bringing investors together and to start testing these approaches out at scale. From the donor side, I would just put forward two opportunities. First of all, an invitation for folks to look into joining the Global Nutrition Financing Alliance that you heard from Jim and Andy about earlier, which we launched the Eleanor Crook Foundation with the DFC and USAID very recently. We are really working to put deals together to invest in actual solutions like N3F, to learn as we go. And we need more folks that are willing to come alongside us, particularly folks like USAID and DFC, with that more donor-based catalytic capital. The other thing I put forward for private donors interested in this, I would suggest that you join Stronger Foundations, which is the new coalition of philanthropies for nutrition. Stronger Foundations is working hard to bring private donors around the world together to address malnutrition, and we're going to have a big working group focused on these private sector business solutions. So another area where you can get involved.
Thank you, Will. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Alok, and thank you, Will. So we talk about innovative financing, but what's the definition of innovation? Innovation is the successful exploitation of new ideas. Well, we've got the new ideas. We've got the vetting mechanisms to test them, to see if they're any good. We certainly have the need. 1 in 3 people are malnourished. The number's going up. The need is urgent. So we now need to match the needs with the ambition and the courage. It's time for all of us to take a calculated risk on ending malnutrition. Not doing so would be an even greater risk. So please join the Alliance, join N3F, join the work that GAIN, the Power of Nutrition, ECF, DFC, USAID, the Earthrins group. Please join these groups, and together we can turn this around for nutrition. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Will. Today is a great example of the benefits of collaboration and intelligence sharing for the greater impact. And before I close the session, a few final housekeeping points. The recording would be published on the Power of Nutrition's YouTube channel and emailed to all attendees from the session after the session via Zoom. We'll also create a summary report, which will be published at the N4G Secretariat in the new year. We at the Power of Nutrition are really excited to work all the stakeholders, all the partners on our approach for the nutrition ventures that we'll be working on next year. We hope you enjoyed and benefited from today's dialogue. Looking forward to collaborating with us for increasing the investments for nutrition in the years to go ahead. And we look forward to hearing new and strong commitments for funding nutrition from the N4G Summit over the next few days. Enjoy the summit, and thank you all again for your participation today. Goodbye, and looking forward to join all of you on the summit discourse tomorrow and day after. Thanks to everyone, all the participants, all the panelists, everyone.
Thank you, Alok.
Thank you all. Thank you. Excellent.
Thanks.